Hello and welcome to the Maritime Impact Podcast. I'm your host Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. Shipping companies operating in Europe have made significant efforts making sure that they comply with the expansion of the European emission trading system to shipping. This kicked in from January 1st, as I trust everybody is aware of. And obviously, this has not only been about legal compliance, but it's also been about making sure that the commercial and contractual implications are taken care of. But the end of 2024 is fast approaching, and the EU has another regulation ready to go, namely the FuelEU Maritime regulation. And this kicks in from January 1st, 2025. Longtime listeners will have heard me talk about FuelEU Maritime in previous episodes, but the sense I'm getting from the shipping community is that many have not yet really been thinking much about it. In simple terms, dealing with the ETS has consumed a lot of bandwidth the last few months. So today I'll be recapping where we stand with the FuelEU Maritime and highlighting some key elements that are still outstanding. So let's get on with the show. We hope you enjoy this episode. FuelEU Maritime, FEM from now on, is the next regulatory step from the EU, taking effect from 1st of January 2025. FEM applies requirements to the greenhouse gas footprint of the energy used on board ships with, at least initially, the same vessel coverage as the ETS, namely cargo and passenger vessels above 5,000 gross tons. FEM also applies geographical coverage similar to the ETS. For voyages that go into or out of the EU and EEA, half of the energy used is considered in scope, but for voyages between EU and EEA ports, as well as within the same ports, the scope is 100% of the energy used. The regulation takes into account the use of shore power, and it gives credit to vessels with wind-assisted propulsion systems, but for most ships it will, at least initially, be all about the fuel used on board. FEM imposes requirements to the annual average well-to-wake greenhouse gas footprint of the fuel used, covering not only CO2, but also methane and N2O, tightening in 5-yearly increments. Starts off in 2025 with a 2% reduction requirement from a defined baseline and tightens to an 80% reduction in 2050. Note the well-to-wake aspect. In contrast to the ETS, which is only about smokestack emissions, FEM takes into account the greenhouse gas production footprint for any given fuel used. What all this means is that at its core, the FuelEU Maritime is not about how much fuel you burn, but rather about what you burn. Traditional energy efficiency measures therefore don't help with compliance, though they do reduce the economic impact of the actions necessary to become compliant. At its core, the FEM is designed to shift maritime fuel consumption away from conventional fossil fuels towards green alternatives. A second part of the legislation is the requirement for passenger and container vessels to connect to shore power for port stays exceeding 2 hours. This only becomes effective in 2030, and while there are numerous exemption clauses in the regulations, the cost of non-compliance will be significant. Compliance is ascertained on an annual basis, where data is reported and verified during the first half of the following year. But be aware that the FEM regulation has teeth. 2 consecutive years of non-compliance can lead to ships being banned from EU waters, and in certain cases, detained until compliance is achieved. In most cases, this will likely be handled by paying a fine. Finally, it's worth noting that, at least conceptually, FEM forms a basis for the EU's greenhouse gas fuel intensity proposal, in short GFI, to the IMO, though the technical details differ. You may recall that I also talked about this in the previous episode on the outcome of MEPC 82. So one implication is that once the IMO's GFI enters into force in 2027, we can expect to have 2 similar, but not identical, regulations applying for voyages into, out of, and within the EU and EEA. So, to the key question here, how can ship operators go about ensuring they are compliant? Looking at the design of the FEM regulation, one of the striking features is that ships operating on liquid fossil fuels will be non-compliant from day one. If operating on fossils, the initial 2% reduction requirement to greenhouse gas intensity is in fact only met by certain LNG-powered ships depending on their engine technology. Unless you're lucky and already using LNG and the right engine technology, your first compliance option is of course to start using other alternative fuels. And the immediate solution for many is to use a small amount of sustainable biofuel, which will be sufficient to achieve a 2% footprint reduction. But when running the numbers, we find that even the pretty limited demand generated by the 2% requirement is likely to go well beyond what is available to shipping, at least initially. And other alternative fuels are certainly not available yet in any meaningful volumes. The second option is to work with what's called the compliance balance. In essence, this is a difference between the required greenhouse gas intensity and actual greenhouse gas intensity multiplied by the energy use in scope of the FEM, giving a balance measured in tons of CO2 equivalent. If you're non-compliant, you can remedy this negative balance by pooling with over-compliant ships to attain overall pool compliance. Given the flexibility built into the pooling mechanism, this essentially turns compliance units into tradable commodities, while pool membership can be extended to undercompliant ships for an appropriate consideration. In fact, we're actually already seeing brokerages and others starting to offer pooling facilitation services, and as a bit of a teaser, I plan to have a conversation with one of these in a later episode this season. The compliance balance will be managed through mandatory ship-specific accounts that will be set up in the existing EU Thetis system. This is the EU-run database that companies have been using for MRV-related purposes since 2018. In addition to managing pooling, the Thetis accounts can be used to handle banking of excess compliance units for the use in later years, or for the borrowing of compliance units from the following year. If you do borrow from your own next year balance, you will get hit with a 10% interest now. As an example, if you borrow 500 tons CO2 equivalent from 2026 in order to meet your 2025 obligations, you will then start 2026 with a negative compliance balance of 550 tons CO2 equivalent. It's also possible to become compliant by paying a penalty based on a negative compliance balance. While this is designed to be dissuasive, it is a legitimate compliance strategy and may be attractive to some, at least initially when the availability of alternative fuels can be expected to be insufficient and costs considerably higher than those of fossil fuels. The penalty presently sits at €2,400 per ton of VLSFO equivalent and is applied by converting your year-end negative compliance balance in CO2 equivalent to VLSFO equivalent and then multiplying by €2,400 per ton. It's important to note that if paying the penalty is your chosen strategy, an additional 10% gets added on for every consecutive year of penalty payment. The penalty level also remains subject to adjustment and will be re-evaluated for the first time at the end of 2024, though we do not expect changes this time around. When running the numbers and comparing the costs of the ETS and the penalty mechanisms of the FEM, the ETS hits much harder initially. Cost parity between the two can be expected around 2035, and after that the FEM penalties start to significantly outweigh the ETS costs. This is because the penalty scales with the compliance gap, and if you don't move to lower intensity fuels, the compliance gap will increase every 5 years as the requirements tighten. So with this rough overview of the regulation itself, what are some of the challenges and complexities that we see? The first one I want to mention goes back to who is a legally responsible party. As you may recall, for the ETS and the MRV, the European Commission has landed on the registered owner having legal responsibility by default. This can be delegated to the ISM company if mutually agreed. But for the FEM, the EC has decided that the legally responsible company shall be the ISM company, full stop. This misalignment between MRV and the ETS on the one hand and the FEM on the other will cause challenges for the information flow between owners and the ISM company, especially as the MRV will not only underpin the ETS but also the FEM. And when you start thinking about the complex interplay between owners, managers, and charterers, and throw pooling arrangements and the monetary value of compliance units into the mix, you'll see that existing contractual frameworks between parties will need additional clauses governing the commercial implications of FuelEU Maritime. As a second teaser, we will be diving into this in much greater detail in the next episode of the pod. Similar to what the ETS is already doing to emission monitoring, the FEM will drive a need for operators to have full control over what fuel they're using, when they're using it, and where they are when doing so. Therefore, verified, close to real-time data will be necessary to satisfy the commercial requirements and contractual obligations. We then have the issue of the first relevant compliance date. While the regulation as such kicks in from 1st of January 2025, the actual first default compliance date was 31st of August 2024. This was a date by which the FEM monitoring plan needed to be submitted to the verifier, and obviously we're well past that date now. On the bright side, being overdue comes with no penalties, but this plan really needs to be submitted to the verifier before monitoring starts on January 1st, at least for those operating in Europe. The monitoring plan template has now been made available by the EC, and here at DNV, this is already implemented and available in our production systems. There are a number of other design and implementation issues still to be addressed, even though much has been resolved in the last few months. The Commission is working on these, and industry is providing input through bodies such as the EC-run European Sustainable Shipping Forum. Some of these issues apply across the MRV, the ETS, and the FEM, such as, for instance, consideration of how to include onboard carbon capture and storage. Others are unique to each individual piece of legislation. A few of the remaining FEM issues to be addressed include the determination of relevant container transshipment ports, which is likely, but not guaranteed, to be the same as for the ETS, and how to handle actual measurements of methane and N2O emissions, which is an alternative to using the default emission factors. Additionally, the necessary Thetis software updates are not yet in place, and this is of course a pretty crucial bit of the actual implementation of the regulation. And finally, we're waiting for an updated FAQ to be published dealing with a large number of essential clarifications. The signals are that this will be available late November, and we just hope that that's going to happen. So to the key takeaways. First, FuelEU Maritime is coming sooner than you may think. For many, August 31st has been the first relevant compliance date, with the 1st of January 2025 marking the start of data monitoring and reporting. Second, understand your compliance options. I cannot stress this enough. You have 3: alternative fuels, working with compliance units, or paying the penalty. Third, examine the commercial implications of how legal responsibility differs from the ETS and how this interacts with commercial considerations around pooling and compliance units. As mentioned, I'll be discussing this with other experts and stakeholders over the next 2 episodes, so stay tuned for that. And fourth and last, same as for the ETS, get control of your fuel usage and emissions data. Granular, verified data is becoming necessary to manage the commercial aspects, including satisfying contractual obligations. And in reality, the commercial requirements of data granularity go well beyond what is needed to demonstrate mere legal compliance. And here I want to make you all aware that DNV's latest Emission Connect update now helps you to control the compliance aspects and the commercial challenges and risks that arise from both the FuelEU Maritime and the EU ETS. You've been listening to the Maritime Impact Podcast from DNV with me, Eirik Nyhus. This was a summary of the state of play for the FuelEU Maritime regulation, just a few weeks out from entry into force. Later this season, we'll discuss the commercial and contractual implications of the FuelEU Maritime, as well as do a deep dive into compliance pooling. For scheduling reasons, the time gap to these episodes may be a bit longer than normal. Your patience is greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating or review. Thank you for listening.